Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who is spending Independence Day proudly wearing a patriotic red, white, and blue tentacle-shaped muumuu.
Tim Longo. Nice. Good callback.
Yeah. Yep, there you go. I threw in the tentacle-shaped in case that wasn't enough.
I wouldn't have gotten it without it.
Yeah, I know.
Day of the Tentacle. For our guest, we played Day of the Tentacle on the podcast before, so it was appropriate callback.
So you mentioned we have a guest. Would you like to throw out an introduction there?
Yes, I'm very excited. We are very excited to have Marc Laidlaw on, who was at Valve for 18 years, but before that was already an accomplished author. Including some books all the way back to 1985, Dad's Nukes, Neon Lotus, which was nominated for a Philip K. Dick Award, and a few others. This 37th Mandala in 1996 was nominated for World Fantasy Award and awarded the International Horror Guild Award, and also published in various stories in fantasy and science fiction magazine, but then in 1997 joined up with Valve, and for 18 years worked on pretty much everything there, which we'll get into with him shortly, including Half-Life, of course, which we're talking about today, Half-Life 2, all the episodes, and contributed to Portal, Counter-Strike, Data Defeat, you name them all, Team Fortress, and then he has a fun little joke on his website about Dota 2 as well, becoming the pun master. And so, welcome, Marc, to the podcast.
Hey, thanks very much for having me. I thought that was a Mumu callback, actually, because my current project I'm working on is called Mumu for Mima. And
are you serious? We missed that. Sorry. Totally intended. It was, actually.
No tentacles, though. Only Mumu.
I do a lot of deep research. So Marc, I guess I didn't realize you hadn't come in at the beginning of Half-Life proper, but of course that makes sense given the sort of spate of writing in the industry at the time. Can you sort of set the stage for where Half-Life was when you joined up with Valve?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, just to correct some misapprehensions, I really worked on Half-Life 1 and 2 and the episodes 1 and 2, and then after kind of percolating around on different internal projects, ended up on Dota 2 for the next few years, but didn't do anything on Counter-Strike or Team Fortress, really, or Portal. Portal 1 was all Eric Wolpaw, and then Jay Pinkerton joined, and Eric and Jay really teamed up on that. So I get that a lot. People ask, what I did on Portal, and the answer is nothing. I came up with the name Aperture Science, and that was about it.
Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, it's a challenge with credits for Valve, of course, because you guys, have your credits different from pretty much anyone in the industry when it comes to just listing everyone at the company. So thanks for the clarification on that.
I was like the only writer there for a long time, but a lot of the other projects we had didn't really need writers. But that's why I came in to Valve in the first place. It formed sometime before I got there. I was doing research about id Software and working on an article about the making of Quake, and that was how I got to know people in the industry, including Marc Laidlaw, who was friends with Mike Harrington and knew Mike and Gabe and knew that they were starting up this game company in Washington. And I lived in San Francisco at the time and was trying pretty hard to figure out a way to get somebody in the game industry to think more about using id's engine to do story-related games and storytelling. Because from what I had seen they were doing, you could do all this sort of cool narrative stuff with it, but nobody was doing that. And the storytelling that was happening in games at that time was not happening in the first-person shooter format at all. So I was reviewing games for Wired, and I was doing other random reviews for Wired I really got sucked into level design and using the editors of the day, including one that came along called Worldcraft. And when I started tinkering around with Worldcraft, it turned out that Gabe and Mike were just starting to talk to the guy who had created Worldcraft, this young guy named Ben Morris, who lived in Victoria. And they were hoping to hire Ben to come down and do tools work at this company they were starting. And they needed some INS recommendation written from like a legitimate journal. So it's like that, even though that was not really how I thought of myself. I was just kind of doing it for fun on the side. But that led to an invitation to Valve to meet Ben and kind of see what they were doing there. And so the first time that I went, they had a lot of little test rooms and demos, and I got glimpses of what they were doing with the Quake engine, which they were licensing at the time. So a lot of the stuff that's come out from Valve's early GDC or E3 demos, like colored lights and transparency and AI flocking behavior and things like that. Things that were just sort of one cell room in the Quake engine, or the modified Quake engine. That was what that was about all I saw the first time that I went there. And we kind of sized each other up. I don't think they really knew why I was there, and I didn't quite know what I was doing there either. And there was a little bit of talk at the end of the day or two that I spent there about how maybe we could use a writer for some of this stuff. And then I went home. There was no further talk of it, but a little while after that, I got a call from Greg Coomer, I believe, asking if I would be available to do some contract work to try to help them think about story and how to apply that to what they're doing. So I did that for a little while remotely, and it mostly related to one of the projects that was in the pipeline at that time, which was a game that was never really made called Prospero. The code name for it was Prospero. So I started out just writing emails and helping them think about how to... I was learning as much as I was trying to help them solve problems. I was really just learning from what they were doing, trying to understand the world they were in to design this, whatever Prospero was going to be. And then after a few weeks of that, it seemed like it made more sense for me to go and be there. So went and checked out the area, ended up moving up there in summer of 97 and started there actually July 1st, 1997. So exactly 20 years ago today was the first day on payroll at Valve. And then Half-Life was, I remember in the time before I joined, they started doing press because they'd been very much in stealth mode. All people really knew about Valve at that time was that they had hired some people from the Quake community, including John Guthrie, who was known as Chorioth, and then Steve Bond, who went by Wedge. These guys are pretty well known in places like Blues News and that whole Quake mod community. There was a lot of excitement that Valve was plucking people like this to come and do level design and coding. And otherwise, if you went to their website, all that was there was a map of Kirkland, which showed where to find the company. So people really didn't know what they were doing. And then in the time between my first trip to Valve and my starting there, they came up with a name for this game that they were working on. I remember Harry Teasley telling me in an email they had, apologizing for not having gotten back to me because they were doing a bunch of press for this thing they had named Half-Life. And as soon as I read that name, I just got a buzz, like, it was so exciting. There was something so right about this name, even though I didn't really know what it was. I peeked at some levels they were working on. It just had this amazing resonance. So when I actually came to Valve, I knew that a bunch of guys were working on this Half-Life thing. I was working on something different. I would mostly not see anything that was going on the Half-Life project, but then I knew it was on a short cycle. It was supposed to It was supposed to ship pretty soon, and then it was going to kind of start a funding cycle. They were going to do a quick do Quake engine game, and then that was going to generate the funds to really make the game they wanted to make next, whatever that might be. But basically, to make them solvent. So Mike Harrington came in and asked me one afternoon if I could spend a few weeks working on this Half-Life project just to try to help them figure out story, like figure out how to do this thing they were trying to do. And it was supposed to be like a month and a half of work, something like that. And I said, sure, and tried to come up to speed on what that was, and which involved kind of sitting down with level designers and seeing things in progress. I saw a lot of like the early Office levels to start with. John Guthrie was building out those old 50s Cold War corridors and trying to figure out what to do with that. But then, as that turned out to be the next year and a half, and Prospero kind of fell by the wayside as more and more people in the company just turned focus completely on Half-Life, and it became the project. So it went from something that was totally underway when I got there, but didn't have a lot of shape. I had heard a lot of things that everybody had heard in the press at that time. Gabe talking about the idea that you were going to, if you started at one end of the space, if you went back to that, if you backtracked to that position after 3 days of playing the game, which would be like 3 weeks in game time, then you would have found moss and blown walls and things like that. I definitely was in early promotion and excitement about things that I think a lot of these were Dave's wish list of features for a game that, as somebody who'd never made a game before, things he was pushing the team to do without really knowing what was possible. And they were kind of on a bullet point list of things we thought we should do for some reason. But it wasn't really until we started trying to pull it together as a story that we had like a selective criteria for features, like things that made sense to invest time in versus things that should fall by the wayside. Ironically now, 20 years later, it's those things that fell by the wayside that you get asked about all the time, even though, because they were mentioned in press at one point in 1997 or 98, they're the things people come back to because they never actually saw them in the game. Whereas they're things that we talked about doing for a week or two, and then happened to be the week or two that somebody was doing press. we never pursued them really beyond a certain point, but they remain out there bouncing around. Like, why didn't you guys do this? There's a lot of alternative and parallel universe versions of Half-Life that people ask about. I get mail a lot from people asking about different versions of the game, and they seem to think that they're well-realized games, and we went down a long path of development before deciding very consciously not to pursue them. And the truth is, we just were constantly experimenting and trying stuff, and depending on when you talk to somebody at a particular time, they would think what they're doing is critical and is going to be in the game that shipped, and then a week later they'd have had a totally different set of enthusiasms that they were focused on that were now the most important thing in the game.
That's funny. I mean, that sounds like a very Molyneux style of development. When you just talk to the press and those become the features.
There's a lot of outward-facing press that is sort of inwardly directed to design teams throughout the industry. That seems to be a common thing. Like you make a promise that sounds outrageous, partly to terrify your team into pulling it off. Especially if you haven't figured out a better way to goad them into following it, because people will tend to just do the thing that they know how to do instead of stretching.
One of the things we talked a lot about, I'd like to dig deeper into some of the stuff you're talking about, sort of the story side of things, and the sense of place and a fully realized. I think there's a quote maybe from Gabe or something, and from one of you guys as far as like the goal for Half-Life, or maybe in general for Valve at the time, just this sense of fully realized place that really wasn't, as you said, kind of at the top, and on the research you were doing for Quake and stuff, really wasn't much being done in this space, especially in first-person space, with a deeper story for the time, and also just a fully realized place. And like, was that something that you brought to the table? Was that something that they already were working on before you came in, and you added to it? Like, how was that, so fully realized for the time? Because just for Brett and I going back and playing it again, it still holds up when it comes to putting all those pieces together, especially from sort of a backdrop narrative of it all. So how, like, was that the focus of it, or did that kind of come out organically? Can you talk a little more deeply about that?
I think that was a focus of the team early on, like before I got there. They just didn't really have a good set of tools for doing it, other than building levels. So levels tended to be unified by a tile set, and by textures and models and things like that, but not by people talking to each other to make sure the thing they were building was going to support the thing someone else was building.
Okay.
It was always seemed to be like one of the things that appealed to me when I got there was that sense of unity of place and purpose, and it resonated a lot with stuff like the old, Edgar Allan Poe's totality of effect. It seemed like a narrative strategy that they were intuitively going for from the start. So I think a lot of people in the field at the time sensed that it was the time you could start to do this, and nobody was really thinking in those terms yet. What's odd is in a fantasy game, probably there was more deliberation about world building and things like that, and you'd spend a lot of work doing hundreds of years of thousands of years of history in your lore before you'd ever lay down a texture. But for science fiction, it seemed more random, like it was just about the monster shooting gallery. So, but they definitely had the idea it was going to be a research base. It was going to be self-contained, underground base. That always seemed pretty important. The things that the level designers were doing when I got there were just a series of discrete rooms and tunnel sections, and they had a sense that they were going to all fit into this larger structure. But there weren't a lot of it wasn't designed from the top down. It was kind of designed ahead of time to be something where all the designers could do what they wanted, and then it would be fit together afterward, and it would just magically work. I kind of used to compare it to like one of those, like the Thieves' World anthology series, where there's an editor at the beginning that throws out an idea for a shared world anthology, and every writer goes off and writes a chapter of it, but it's a self-contained story. They don't read anybody else's stuff, so what you get is kind of a mishmash. It's all set in one city, but they don't really connect to each other in a way that makes it feel like one unified thing. So I did kind of want to solve that problem, although totally backed into it. I mean, I was probably working with level designers on an independent level at first, and we would just kind of solve a problem of the room. Like, how do we make this corridor exciting? Well, you have a zombie break out of a window as you go around a corner, and then that leads to this door here where the thing jumps out of a room. It was all problem solving on that level without so much thinking about, well, say we've gone through this whole level here in terms of overall pacing. How do we make sure the next guy's level that we're going through is not exactly the same, or it's not like a step backwards in terms of difficulty or the kind of creatures we're going to be seeing, and that these things build up, like you'd introduce a head crab, and then you'd introduce a head crab zombie, and those stand in some sort of narrative progression. So early on, I think I talked through some of these things with people from the tool set we had and the monsters that had been created and the levels that they were building. But it was a lot of early level design that was done on the game. Each designer was sort of an independent authority, and they were used to working alone, and there was sort of competitiveness between them. And it took quite a while before they started to kind of function as a team. And there's been talk about, at some point, Gabe, and specifically Gabe, but everybody kind of played through the whole game, and it was decided that it was not going to be good enough, so we need to go back to the drawing board and start all over again and make sure all these pieces work together. That was a point where an overall group of people looked at the levels as part of a larger whole, and started telling the level designers, hey, you're not building the whole world yourself, you're building a piece of the world that needs to support what the other people are building. And at that point, I started to get in, because I was one of the people who would do reviews of the levels each week as they went through building stuff out, and started looking at, hey, there's a piece you did here that's really cool. Why don't we put this over here or hint at it in another piece of level that someone else is designing? And initially, that was just considered robbery and looting. Like, everybody wanted the glory for their own level to be the first place this thing appeared, even if it was something that helped solve a problem for the game.
Yeah.
In the narrative position. So that was that started happening pretty late. I think if we'd had that approach from the start, you'd have had a better sense of narrative progression. And we're lucky that we had as much time as we did to start to go in and work out things that early in the game that were going to pay off later. Because, and also in the later parts of the game, one of the disconnects between Zen and the rest of the game is we didn't have that tool at our disposal. It was totally disconnected from Black Mesa, so there was nothing you could really set up in Black Mesa that was going to pay off in Zen, and there weren't any things we knew were coming in Zen that we needed to lay down early on in Black Mesa. The other, this was much more of an issue when we went into Half-Life 2, and we had a lot of people working on Half-Life who were concerned with consistency and things like that, specifically Randy Lundeen. When we going straight from Half-Life into Half-Life 2, he wanted an overall map of where everything is in relation to everything else, so that we never had to have the problem of trying to retrofit things after the fact into spaces where they wouldn't fit. Like the one whole convoluted area around the radioactive missile silos, and you kind of go through the tubing and the pipes, and you turn on the power to get into I think it leads up to the tentacle silo. If you take all those maps and you put them in the same space, they overlap each other. It's not a real physical space.
Right.
That sort of thing drove some people absolutely nuts. And we're like, this can never happen again. So, right. So that's just an example of how the Unity was sort of retrofit and applied to things after the fact, but led to a belief that was really important. So from a game design philosophy to start with that, a lot of people are different. Some people love to just start building a room and then see where that leads, and kind of they're dreaming with the tools and exploring and inventing, which is great, but that's a good thing to do maybe in rough draft mode. At some point, you're going to need to, you can create problems for other people if you're not paying attention to how one piece fits into another piece. Everybody had worked on things like packs and little self-contained worlds.
Everybody had been lone wolves.
Yeah,
something like that.
Level designing gods where they're alone in their own building an entire world, and it's all a manifestation of their genius.
Yeah, it's interesting because we did talk and speculate a lot about. We talked about this sort of the general notion that every level had its own sort of theme and identity, and we were sort of, we had the positive spin on that, I guess, in that it sort of it made each of the levels, or each of the episodes, I guess I'll say, because it's not necessarily level based, more memorable, right? Because you had each one. But then to your point, like, also having been a level designer around this era myself, I definitely am familiar with that sort of lone wolf problem, I guess I'll say, and because you could do so much of it yourself in those days, you didn't have, a bigger team around level design that was sort of like getting it all working together like you do now as one big team for one level. So it's very interesting that kind of the retrofitting. I mean, the crazy thing about that at the time, and it's awesome you guys had such a high bar for yourself, but sort of all the way that the level you mentioned in the nuclear area was kind of wrapping around inside of itself, like nobody notices that stuff usually, right? So there still was a great success of that connected world. I think the revelation just specifically of just being able to go back and forth between those loads was such a novel thing that it really made up for a lot of those blemishes that you didn't really even notice as a player. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you notice unless you built something like a Dark Souls-like world where everything is carved out of a single piece, and you have that great moment where you come to an area you've been before, and you realize how. I mean, it's one of the great things about working in those 3D spaces, and everybody feels a little bad about cheating it, even though the player doesn't notice. I think the designer does. You feel like, the design, it could have been a little more elegant and a little more perfect if we hadn't had to do that little kludge. So, yeah, definitely more of an internal thing. I think something like that drove Randy nuts, where it wouldn't bother other people. I mean, there's something kind of those days. I think there's a lot that people miss of them. Like, we definitely moved into a realm at Valve where you work rough and get people away from polishing bevels before they move on to the next room. And people were responsible for their lighting and their gameplay and every aspect of a level. And the way things went was more and more, hey, you hire somebody who's really good at lighting, and you have somebody from another discipline who's really good at the flow or the setting up the story scenes or setting up, let's paint this level out and then hand tune this. Moving away from like the lone author of a lot of these things, I think that was definitely a shift for a lot of people in terms of what they enjoyed about the design process. I mean, there were people who definitely kind of got disconnected from it because they loved having ownership of all parts of it. So what made a better game didn't necessarily lead to something that was as satisfying for the individual creator. It meant more sort of like a cinema process where somebody's doing lights and somebody's doing this, and somebody's doing that, and maybe that requires more of an overall director kind of position to hold everything together, which is a thing that we never really had. So you need people to keep really engaged and passionate about the sole authorship thing, even as you're doing something collaboratively with a team, because it's not. There's not ever going to be a person who just comes in and pulls the whole thing together in a way that you might on a game with like a Miyamoto and in charge of it.
Yeah. Now, was this sort of the genesis of the Cabal that was described?
Yeah.
In
The
an article
playing that directorial role, but even then, it was made of individuals, and people had different areas of expertise. So you would find maybe somebody a lot like in Half-Life 1 in the whole test chamber. A lot of that was group design, and then it was kind of handed off to the individuals to build. And by saying group design, only in a general sense. Like we knew, when I got to Valve, we knew the game started with some disaster having happened that triggered monsters coming from another dimension. Nobody really knew what it was, but they had built a test chamber where that creature called a Panther Eye, which was a kind of early monster model, attacks the scientist and drags him off. So I'd seen that as like one of the early demos when I came to the company, and I remember asking about it, like, so is this how the game starts? Is there a game before this? How does this fit in the overall scheme? So there was the idea of this test chamber and this disaster that was going to happen, but when the Cabal got a hold of it, and we got to the point where I could write a script for it, and we recorded that script, then we handed that off to a level designer, who in this case was John Guthrie, and I think he had a space built. I don't remember if he built it himself. It was definitely reworked by people. He kind of had Kelly Bailey sitting in on a lot of this design stuff as a director. Like, Kelly ended up being sort of a director on a lot of these things, where you'd have an individual designer doing the entity placement and the scene logic and throwing out ideas, and then Kelly became sort of the person. He was more technical than I, so I was a little more hands off at that point, and Kelly would be sitting in there with John and Dario and Dave Riller, for instance, kind of as a director in that room, just helping them solve level design problems with more of an overall picture. So when we came in, there was an all-nighter where John Guthrie and Kelly Bailey were just worked over that test chamber sequence. They had all the audio we recorded. They had the general idea because Kelly had been part of that Cabal. So he had kind of received and been part of the group design aspect. He was there. He and John kind of built that thing out of what Kelly knew and what John could do and what audio they had. So even then, it was sort of a creative director in the room at that time, and you might have a different person working with a level designer at another time, and level designers working in isolation, but never really a traditional director for the game overall, but sometimes people would find themselves in that role.
Man, that's crazy. Fascinating.
Yeah, this is all a long time ago, but this stuff is still pretty vivid. Those early days happened really fast. I mean, it seems like at the time it seemed like it was taking forever, but it was such a small span of time. You know, it was like the first year and a half when I got to Valve. It all happened.
Yeah, they basically dumped you right into the trenches, and so you have, you hit the ground running in a big way. And when you're like in the middle of that, I mean, certainly I can remember any moment of pretty much any time I worked with Tim. It all just sticks with you, it because you're so intensely working hard and it just, I don't know, it etches itself into your brain or something.
Yeah, Dave Riller at the time said it was sort of like going to war, like mobilizing with a small group of people to go, just this intense thing where nobody's sleeping, you don't go home, and that was the mode for a lot of these people a lot of times. They had moved to Washington from elsewhere. They didn't really have any of their friends outside the company, and very few of us had family there either. So there was a lot of incentive to just stay at work and stay working on the game like 7 days a week. And people lived and ate and drank and breathed Half-Life for a couple of years.
Do you remember how big the team was at the time, or obviously you read the credits, but roughly?
Well, when I first came to Valve, I think there was like 15 people there, something like that. And
yeah,
I was part of an expansion when a number of people joined around the time I did, and then some of those dropped out before we shipped Half-Life, and then there was a kind of a big influx toward the end of the project there where we brought in the Team Fortress guys and stuff like that. There was Gabe and Ken Birdwell, Dario, of the ones I know who were kind of still around for the longest period of time, and Ted Backman and Randy Lundeen. I probably shouldn't do this because I need to write it down or I'm going to start repeating it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, no, just numbers. I mean, just 15. Like it's a good sort of state of things, kind of cemented in people's heads. I mean, on the jumping topics a little bit, another thing that at least I thought it was interesting, I think Brett did too, that we talked a fair amount about during the episodes is kind of I would say a pretty unique theme, setting and character for the game. And you said that you mentioned earlier that before you got there, they had already talked about sort of a science installation, and that there was going to be this disaster, and there was sort of monsters from another world and stuff. But can you talk a little bit about and you even mentioned the name when you'd heard the name, kind of being so intriguing to you, and I think that's, from my memory as a player at the time, and also kind of just newly a developer, it was so different from everything else out there, even from Doom and stuff that had come before. And I mean, can you delve a little bit more into sort of that, like the thematic side of things? And Gordon Freeman himself, I think, would be interesting if there's anything to say about him at this era, or even Half-Life 2 if you want to. Yeah,
it was the era of the sort of tough Space Marine or
exactly,
Duke Nukem type, and there was a real conscious effort to not do that. Everybody loved those games, but didn't want to do them again. I think maybe part of the buzz of just the name Half-Life was that the gimmick in this thing was going to be science, and that was cool. Like, it was set in a science lab, and there was a military installation aspect to it, but mostly it was going to be, it was science fiction. It was going to be have a cool science element, and So a lot of the early like the rooms people were building were around things like crazy science experiments with sound amplification and lasers and things like that. And that was a really, like, whether the level designers sort of glommed onto this knowing they were going to be able to do cool stuff with it that was not stereotyped or super cliched already. It was really smart, I think, because a lot of the the gamers were into D&D, but they were not really into science fiction per se. So they thought about science and science fiction in a non-cliched way. Like if you told them they were going to do something set on another planet, it would have been all alien stuff. If you told them it was the future, it would have been all Blade Runner. But because they were doing something set kind of in a modern day historical weird mix of periods and with sort of mad scientist types, they didn't go somewhere obvious with it. They just kept coming up with weird original stuff. It was like maybe a little accidental that we ended up with the science team that just generated a world that to me feels original. Like it didn't really seem like it owed a lot. Well, the original, people always talk about the impetus being Stephen King's The Mist, but that goes as far as, well, there's a military base nearby that was doing research. I mean, in that story, The Mist, it doesn't really get into the science of it or anything. It's more about the monsters. So there was something, like level design itself, one of the things that I love about it is it's kind of where the art and science come together. Like it's all the technology of game design, of the engine, with the art of game design, and it's art and science just in this really amazing place where they meet. So when you're designing a level and you're designing a puzzle on a level, you're doing these little mini science experiments in a way, and you're building traps and puzzles and magic tricks out of this stuff. So the technology lends itself really well to making a game that's about technology out of control. And you can see that, like Black Mesa is just this big, elaborate clockwork toy, which is kind of how a lot of my favorite levels in all games work that way. You get the intricacy and the way the gears mesh and the way the Chinese puzzle box, the secret compartments and all that stuff open up. It's the technology of magic. It's really stage illusion kind of stuff. That sort of thing I think it's always been really interesting to me because it's even though storytelling, the entertainment experience of a story, it all takes technology to build that. Whether you're using the techniques of storytelling or the techniques of making a movie or the techniques of building a game, there's technology in there somewhere. And you're looking for a response from people. You kind of know how they're going to respond. Like Hitchcock would talk about, if he could just push a button and get an audience reaction, then he would, bypass the whole movie thing. He could figure out how to get a reaction out of people.
Yeah.
And that's what was so fun that it was all in the form of this science lab world. And then from that, the characters just emerge. Like, okay, all our characters basically have to be scientists. To tie into Half-Life 2, when we went from this super internal, unified Black Mesa, where you never really know anything about the outside world, the first problem we had was, well, how do we build an outside world when we didn't set anything in motion? There's nothing logically flows from Black Mesa into the outside world. And it took us a long time of spinning around before we went, oh, the science team. That's what unifies the thing, is going to be the science team.
Right.
That suddenly, okay, now I knew who our characters are for Half-Life 2. We know the focus of Half-Life 2. That makes it feel like more Half-Life instead of just another random alien invasion setting. So
yeah, wow, that's really interesting.
A lot was not deliberate. A lot was just emerged from what we happen to be doing.
Yeah, that's well said about the convergence of technology and art and science and magic. That's going to stick with me. I think, and there's also a great meta point there, maybe about, well, games in general, but I think about Valve as well. I haven't read this before, but I'm sure somebody has compared Black Mesa and Valve. to each other, and there is this experimentation feel about it all, and what it couldn't have been more appropriate for the first game to be about a science base. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and like a magic trick, it actually improves if you know how the trick is done, if it's done really well. If a trick can still wow you, despite the fact that you know how it works, it's like even more impressive. And I feel like Half-Life is full of like stuff that as a game developer I understand what's going on, and of course that Tim and I talked about for 4 episodes. But I still am really impressed by the result, even knowing how it all works, and that's kind of really great.
Probably, and I assume some of that comes from this Microsofty insistence on playtesting that I don't think a lot of other game companies at the time didn't have anybody like Gabe and Mike saying, hey, this is a thing you should do with software, that other game companies were kind of doing it purely for entertainment and not thinking in terms of the end user response, the customer response, but being forced to sit there and watch people play and see them not react to stuff and see stuff go wrong. That just made the whole techniques of the thing stronger and clearer to us, and let us fix the flaws in how it was going to be received by people. I think that's one of the reasons that it still works to the extent it does, because we did spend a lot of time just watching people play it and then going back to the level designers and going, this thing that you were going for, it's not working. So keep in mind what you're trying to get, the response you're trying to get, and let's try something that's more focused and make sure that people are going to get that experience. Because a lot of times that you think you've accomplished it, and then people play something totally different than you planned.
Yeah, I'm really glad. I was hoping that would come up, because I definitely, still to this day, Valve, especially from Half-Life 1 and beyond, but Valve is seen as, as far as usability and playtest goes, just the tip of the spear for that stuff, for history. And then, I think once Microsoft got into Xbox and they started kind of being advocates for that as well. But back in LucasArts, back in the day when Brett and I first started, and it was something that even I became really passionate about, but it was really hard to convince people to spend money on that for whatever weird reason. And it's totally clear that was the key to part of Half-Life's success, because during the previous episodes I talked a lot about like specifically enemy placement and pacing and weapon placement, and without even with someone guiding that stuff every step of the way, it's going to fall down. There's no other way to really get that stuff really finely tuned than usability. And man, there are just lessons in every single level in there. Whether you guys realize it or not at the time, it's just really well paced, and that's not easy to do when you have some singular vision even.
Yeah, the playtesting is just not glamorous. I think there's a negative side to it, though, where too much fixation on that, because what would happen was people would realize playtesting is good, and then it would flip around where playtesting would drive design.
Yeah, totally. It's a balance, for sure.
People don't usually know what they want until you give it to them. So if what you're testing is something that is just a stepping stone, you have to be sure that everybody's they want the payoff. They don't necessarily want the lead up. So if you're just testing a lead up to something, people are going to know, they're going to notice they're missing the payoff. And then the tendency there is to put the payoff up front instead of building to it. So it's very important to remain clear in your mind and kind of trust your long-term judgment and realize if you're playtesting something granular, only playtest that bit, live with the fact that they're not happy with certain aspects of it, but learn from the parts that you expected them to be, happy with or unhappy with.
Yeah, there's definitely a balance.
That came up. That came up recently in postmortems of Uncharted 4, where they had an early level that they were testing where Nathan Drake is he's excavating like some wreck that's like in New Jersey somewhere, so it's like commercial work, and there's no real stakes to the level. and they found that they really had to change the questions that they asked to be able to support the fact that they were actually getting at what they were trying to achieve in the level as part of a larger whole. So, those lessons I think have been well learned, or maybe sometimes need to be relearned, that you can't just constantly throw the glitz and the wows if you're going to make a whole thing that's going to hold together.
Well, across a game that's 30, 40, 50 hours, pacing is really critical. And the tendency is you want to hook people with something that makes them want to get to that stuff later on and be really invested in getting there. But, it's really easy to lose confidence in yourself and just put everything up front because you never know if you're going to make it to the end. And there's a lot of evidence that players don't get to the end of long games. So then it was always painful for us to know we wanted to build a game that was going to have a cool ending, while at the same time you're knowing that the fall off of people who are going to actually see that ending. Most people will never play the ending. Like episode 2, most people didn't play the ending. They watched it on YouTube. There's a lot of, and you can see the statistics for that. There's just a fall off as the game gets harder and harder for whatever reason. Not, only a small fraction of people play to the end of these things. So if you're making a huge game, and I've got the most number of people are going to, enjoy this part here, you got to make the ending great. For pacing purposes, you can't have it be high all the time. You have to have dips and go down and come up again, and it's really hard to trust that that's the way to go and that that's the most rewarding thing to do. Nobody can stay in, full adrenaline all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's to your point, like the balance of playtesting versus direction or at least focus. It's really just the extremes. Like, you're either too far on one side or too far on the other side, and you can get yourself into trouble for sure. But I just feel like there was just a big era at this time, and it's gotten way better over the years, but still not even perfect. I'd say that just there wasn't anyone doing any playtesting at all, and kind of meeting in the middle seems to be a good spot.
We were lucky because the DNA was really good too, because it had a philosophy of transparency. I mean, Doom and Quake, these are not games where there was elaborate tutorials and a bunch of stuff written over the screens. And that was important to us. Like, I think Half-Life inherited a lot of its philosophy directly from Quake. It's like, you should be able to hit the ground running. You should not have to see a bunch of clutter in your visual space. We shouldn't have to teach you anything separately, like, teach you alt keys and all these things. There was a bunch of assumptions at that point that people playing this game were going to be practiced FPS players, and they were going to understand the vocabulary and the conventions of a first-person shooter. So we didn't have to do a lot of that. Like, if you wanted to skip the tutorial because you played Quake, then that was fine to do. But the main thing we had was keep it really clean, keep out of the way, make sure the UI is just, and everything about the experience is totally transparent. Now, that really supported the whole idea that we were building this sort of dreamlike narrative, and we want to do as little as possible to jar the player out of that dream. And I think if the predecessor of Half-Life had been System Shock or something where even if literally we had started with a different engine, and so the conventions you would start with are things that it supported. We ended up with this totally different philosophy for the game you were about to build even before you started building. So it was just kind of like, I think the thing when I played Quake and I understood the licensing model for licensing engines, this is the thing people were doing. I didn't understand why they weren't using it to make story games, because it was clear that you could do that with this, and there was nothing getting in the way of just being this set of eyes moving through a world and unlocking a story as you went along. And that's purely comes from id and their kind of clarity of design right from the beginning.
Yeah, since we're back on story, I'm kind of curious. We haven't talked at all about the protagonist, and it sort of sounds like he may have changed, over the course of development. He wasn't always Gordon Freeman, was he?
He never had a name. like Ivan the Spice Baker. Ivan the Space Baker was a character that I saw later after I'd been there, and people sort of joked around about him, and I saw some models of that guy, but he was not seriously anybody that we used in demos or playing the game. There was no image for Gordon Freeman, really, because we didn't have a multiplayer mode. We didn't really have a camera. Chuck Jones was making models of Gordon, and we had this player model who was unnamed for a long time. We knew that you were a character, and then we knew you weren't Duke Nukem, so you weren't going to do smart aleck, wisecracks. But we didn't really know too much else about that guy until it kind of came down to the wire, and we were like, "Oh, we need a character to put on the box, and we might need a character we can see in cutscenes, and we might need a character for this and that," because we really thought, like things like where Gordon gets knocked out and dragged, we thought that was going to be a cut to a third-person camera, if nothing else, like a security camera where you'd see it happen. So then at that point, we realized, are we going to see this guy going into the test chamber at the beginning? Do we need a model for a guy wearing a lab coat before he gets into the HEV suit? And we didn't have time to build any of that stuff. Nobody had really worked through, so a lot of the fixes were, I guess we just got to work with what we have, which means he's already in his HEV suit. We're never going to see him through a third-person camera, which, for me, it was liberating, and I was kind of excited to realize we were doing away with the cutscenes completely, but that was partly just driven by no model for the character that was in the lab coat, and no time. And it was like, okay, it was more of the streamlining that happened in the last few months of the project. Around the time we put out the demo, the OEM version, I think even when that went out, we thought maybe we'd have a chance to put it in some more of a kind of a wrapper. But the reaction to it was so strong, we figured we better not touch it, and we should instead just take the philosophy that people were responding to and make sure we drove that really hard into the rest of the game. So you had people like Dario immediately taking levels that they've been working on for months, and over the course of the weekend, that level would be totally transformed. Like, what was maybe a quiet exploratory stretch of, exploring some tunnels in a lab was suddenly this, things were leaping out at you, and there was events around every corner, and all sorts of cool stuff happening. And it went from being cool and kind of spooky to, exciting, action-packed, and surprises. And people were they were inspired by just seeing all the elements of the things we've been talking about come together in that test chamber sequence. And then also the reaction of actual players getting their hands on those first few levels. Because there was a crisis of faith at one point where we played through the game we were building and went, this is not really the game we've been telling the world we're delivering. Like, if we ship this, we don't have any right to brag about how we're delivering this really great experience. It was, sort of the monster closet thing, like, what happens in this room? Well, you go in and the lights go out and some monsters jump out of the walls. And then it's like, then that's it? Like, isn't every game doing that? And then there is silence. And that we went back to realizing we needed to just get more granular about how we were designing every room. That every room got better if you had a few people thinking about how, what can happen in this room? Say we have no budget. What can happen in this room? Like, what would be the best thing? And then from that, we draw some pictures and write an outline and then hand it to the level designers, and they would gulp and go off and start building it. But for a while there, it definitely felt like we had lost the thing that inspired everybody. Early on, there was a vision of building this thing nobody could quite describe, and then we kind of got lost in the weeds. But when the test chamber came together and the OEM version went out, everybody just felt strongly in touch with that vision again.
Yeah, I mean, it's we talked about it obviously a lot in the episodes as well, but like as far as demos go, At least on PC, I can't, like Brett and I talked a lot about, just can't think of one of a more important demo just on the industry. And it's kind of, it's cool and interesting and weird to hear you guys kind of with, not really knowing, and I've been in this position as well, not really knowing ahead of time what you have and what it's going to be received. And sometimes it's not received well, sometimes it is, but and then, man, the first person, the no cuts thing being kind of driven by the constraints of production, which is often many great decisions are really driven by just the realities of production. But that particular one, I think and I'll speak for myself, just put on a pedestal of like, yeah, Half-Life, they stuck to first person the whole time. There's no cutscenes, and Gordon never talks and all this stuff. And then to find out that it's actually kind of driven by sort of necessity is really kind of mind blowing for me personally. And that's awesome that you told that story.
I got hooked on the Breaking Bad podcast and the Better Call Saul podcast, and I think we thought that like TV worked at a different standard, but hearing how many times like just came out of desperation where they wrote themselves into a corner, and then they desperately come up with this solution that was a band-aid to them, but everybody else seems like, man, that was brilliant. You were setting that since the first season, and it paid off so well. And Better Call Saul is just an example of them having set themselves a bunch of really hard problems, and the whole world knows what those problems are. Kind of watching themselves solve them has been amazing. So that was reassuring to me that a lot of design, works its way out of corners and kind of you go around and with your eyes closed, bumbling around, and then you have to rely on, if you work on this, you're gonna stumble across the solution if you keep going, and you're open to answers wherever you find them.
Yeah.
Right, and the constraints themselves inspire creativity.
Yeah.
If you don't have that model, now there's a whole bunch of solutions that are off the table. And
I think
now you've got to be creative to come up with a solution that works.
This was a hard thing for level designers, too, from the mod community, when they got to Valve and they realized, hey, I've got these amazing coders sitting next to me who can they can give me the code to do anything I want to do, and it's paralyzing. Compared to the situation that they were in before, was they had an entire tool that they got from Quake or Doom. They knew exactly what they had, and they would just do amazing things with those tools. They knew what their limits were. Now, once you push the limits way back, it took us much, much longer to figure out what was the right thing to do with the tools we had. And that was something like the OEM demo. I think that was the point where people realized, this shows the outer limits of what we need to be working in. This is the box that we're in. This is what our tools do. We don't need more tools. We need all the tools we have let us do this amazing thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Now this is what we're shooting for. More like this and more and better, but within this, these constraints.
Yeah. Yep. Well said. That's a really important point. Man, yeah, just the constraints of tools, and just like as budgets have gotten bigger and bigger over the years, right? And you have more, the teams are bigger and the money's bigger and everything. Like it's not always a good thing, because you're losing that focus. So it's really hard to regain that these days, I'd say. Wow, awesome.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on an hour here,
Mm-hmm.
and we try to aim for that. As much to respect your time as anything else. We wanted to at least give you a chance to plug anything. I know Tim threw out a lot of your previously written work. It sounds like you're working on something called Moo Moo Mima. Did I get that right?
Moo Moo for Mima. Come on, is that real? Is it?
No, it's not. That was the thing I was working on for my kids and all that.
Okay.
No, but yes, I'm working on a Moo Moo mod now. It's just at the moment I'm just kind of trying to figure out what to do next. I took like a year where I basically didn't play any games, and then sort of creeping back in with got my PS4 set up. But I'm writing a little bit. I've got short stories coming out occasionally, which when one of those comes out, it's at my blog at marclaidlaw.com. Otherwise, last year around this time, I guess it's been about a year ago, I took all my old books and all my stories and I bundled them up into some Kindle editions so that I could just put them out there again. So they're all on Kindle now for a couple bucks each, and that's pretty much everything up to now. Like I said, I've got some short stories coming out in like the magazine of fantasy and science fiction and a few other places like that. But yeah, I've been taking a break from games, just starting to enjoy them again.
Yeah.
Well, I really can't play anything like what I worked on. I can appreciate like last week I started playing Prey, and I played the opening, and it was a lot of fun and really amazing, and it gave me like the shakes because suddenly I was back like thinking of. I was on one hand I was just writing a list of all my notes to bring to the team, and
oh my gosh, yeah,
like the AAA title development mode, like it's very hard for me to play something like that and just as a player enjoy it. So I'm enjoying things like Neo and things that are not anything like what I've worked on. But maybe some point I'll get a chance to work on some smaller stuff again and figure out what that might be. But trying to come up with maybe an idea for a novel or something. But yeah, mostly just taking a break.
Good for you, man. Yeah. I mean, taking a year off.
Everybody needs them. Yeah.
Yeah. And not playing games. That's an interesting envious idea. Yeah.
Not going back to the PC and just like, if it doesn't play on my iPad or my MacBook or ideally PS4 is kind of what I'm enjoying most right now. Although the Switch is awesome. I think I spent a month straight playing Zelda. And then I turned it off and put it away. And although now I see there's DLC out, so I have to go.
Yeah, Brett and I do talk. I probably every series of whatever game we're playing, we talk about that sort of, because a lot of the games we're playing are in an era where the teams were smaller, the production cycles were smaller, and you could do more, kind of do more with a smaller team, and the indie movement, obvious point that I'm about to make, but the indie movement is kind of, I think, rejuvenated a lot of folks that have been around the block for a while, because we kind of miss those days of smaller teams. I know Brett and I do, and Brett's working on a small team as we speak. There's now a way to do that, so that's exciting. Maybe in another year or so, you'll come back in, do some indie stuff or something.
Yeah, I always torture myself more like, with the idea that I'm going to learn how to code so I can at least do as a little hobby NetHack kind of roguelike thing. Just for fun.
Sure, yeah.
But there's something in me that is just not a coder. And I hit that wall pretty quickly. I love the idea, and then I just always hit a conceptual wall. So, it's a little frustrating to want to make a little game, but just not be able to make it entirely yourself.
Yeah. Whereas
I can go and write a story, and I know I've got complete control over all the aspects of it. So that's probably the thing I should do.
Right.
The thing that I kept, for the last 5 years or so going, I think it's time to go back to kind of refresh back to my roots and get good at that again and remind myself why I'm doing the thing that I do.
Makes sense. Well, good luck to you, sir. Thank you so much for being on.
Hey,
really appreciate it.
This was really terrific.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's a wonderful game. You have a great legacy. 18 years at Valve. I think that's something I forgot to mention in your intro that I wanted the audience really to kind of sink in. Is I don't think anyone we've had on so far. We've had a really good set of guests, but nobody has stayed at a company for 18 years. That's a cool and rare legacy. So again, thanks for being.
Mario, he was there longer than I was, and he's still there. So.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, well, hopefully Dario will...
Well, he's going to top you, but so far...
I see. Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, guys.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
Bye.
Welcome back from the break, Tim. Do you realize what just happened?
What just happened?
We talked to Marc Laidlaw, man.
Yeah,
that was so good.
To be honest, I didn't think we would get anybody for this one. Valve is just a different company, you know.
Yeah, notoriously secretive.
Yeah, and I was never sure how much of that was kind of policy or how much of that was just respect, you know, and kind of just the team atmosphere they have there, and they just kind of were. They've all had some sort of unspoken pact where they were just really quiet about things, you know. So I just, you know, obviously I went, you know, I asked Mark initially. He came to mind because he had left last year, so I thought maybe we had a better chance. But he, you know, he was discreet. So, and they've been more open. You know, they've been more open about the older stuff over the years. So, but yeah, I'm glad to have him on. He's definitely one of those legendary names out there, especially in the writing side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess our first, like, you know, writer, you know, kind of that being their pure job. I mean.
Yeah.
A lot of people we've had on, and Bill Roper, for example, it was a guy who did some writing, and even, you know, Giannis.
Everyone in those days.
Design. Like back then, it was always like all hands on deck. Like I did the initial story treatment for Starfighter.
Who knew?
You know? Yeah, with Wayne Klein, and you and I both worked together on like vignette type stuff for.
Oh yeah.
Things might play out in Republic Commando. I mean,
well,
back then, it was anybody who had any talent for narrative at all would help because. You know, the industry wasn't employing those sorts of people, and he's like one of the very first kind of names you think of when you think of writing in video games, just because he's been doing it so long.
Yeah, and so devoted to it. Yeah. I mean, to his point about just level designer's role, back when I started level design, like the initial scripts for levels were done by the level designers as well.
Yeah,
like there wasn't, even at LucasArts, there was not always an assigned full-time writer. In fact, on Robo Commando, remember we started out without one and had a hard time convincing people at the time, I think, that we needed to help there, you know, whatever. And then we kind of bounced around through a few of them. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we had, I guess Kaufman helped us. Ryan Kaufman helped us a bit. And of course, Stemley as well, Michael.
Yeah, Stemley and Kaufman both.
But that was at the end of a project where we had done all the dialogue and kind of gone a different direction in terms of the tone and stuff, and gotten some feedback and all that stuff. But yeah, I reach back to that time, and I think, like you mentioned, you know, at LucasArts, you know, often it was the project directors who were the strong writers, and you know, or had that kind of narrative sense, like, you know, Hal Barwood or even Sean Clark and Mike Stemley as a team, or
that was the legacy of the company. Yeah,
Jonathan Ackley and Larry Ahern, and like, you know, and of course Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman. Yeah, it was the whole thing, and those guys were at the top, but they were always making story games, you know. And as Mark was pointing out, it's like, you know, nobody's really pushing story in the first person shooter realm at all.
Yeah, and it didn't. Yeah, to his point, it didn't make sense. You know, like it's they just hit the right time with an amazing thing to prove that it could be done. You know, yeah.
Yeah, and it's
good.
Interesting the way that they got there. I'm so happy we got that perspective. It's funny. I mean, like that they ended up always in first person just because they couldn't afford to do third person.
Yeah, when he was saying that, I was just silently
You're like, all my life is a lie.
Yeah, because we put that stuff on pedestal, right? Like I probably talk about that once a week. I don't know. You know, like it's like, you
certainly did. You certainly did at LucasArts. I mean, we talked about that on Republic Commando because, I mean, that's what we strove to do. Like, you're always in the helmet.
Yeah, and that's the number. That was a key thing in a studio that was really about story and cinematics and cutting, you know, making movie games and kind of stuff, you know. And so it was hard to convince people, but you always had Half-Life as an example of like, well, they did it.
Yeah.
So we should.
They chose to do, and you can do it.
Yeah, son of a.
So good. So good. Anyway, we're gonna turn to a little bit of feedback this time because we've got some questions via email, and you know where they can send those, Tim.
Yeah, at devgameclub@gmail.com.
Oh, good for you. You do know where they go.
I was about to give the email address for Rebel FM.
No, nice.
Because I listened to it enough. Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead with the first one, and then I'll take the second one after we discuss.
Yeah. So this first one is an email from Phil Rosehill. Do you know Phil, or is
No, he's just been emailing to the cast. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I didn't.
And people who listen to the cast and actually send email know that I'm the person who reads them.
Okay. Yeah, Phil's definitely one of us. So, I've been neglectful of my duties as a speedrunning correspondent (TM) for Dev Game Club. Okay, so this is this gentleman. Thank you, Phil.
Yeah.
I only checked the schedule for this year's summer games done quick yesterday, so half of the marathon will be done before your next episode is released. There's always Twitter, perfectly timed for your current game. Half-Life and Half-Life 2 runs are scheduled for the night of Tuesday, July 4th.
So I'll be tweeting that out again tomorrow morning.
Yeah, so we're recording this, and the day before. There is a swordless run of Link to the Past, which he says in parentheses he didn't realize was possible. That also sounds crazy to me. On Thursday night, and the traditional Super Metroid run will be Friday night. I don't know what a low percentage ice race run is, and I'm looking forward to finding out.
Yeah, and he gives the link. He gives the link for the schedule.
Yeah, gamesdonequick.com. Yeah.
Yep.
For your inevitable couch co-op recorded together episode, I love the suggestion of Toe Jam and Earl. The revival is due later this year, so it's good timing. Toe Jam and Earl is a family favorite, even 25 years later. My parents have quite possibly played more hours of this game than anyone else. They played when my sister and I were kids, but really got into it after we moved out, and for the last decade, they've gone to Funkatron at least 20 times a year. Good luck getting through the crunch, he says to Brett.
Yep.
I
thought that was really funny, that Toe Jam and Earl, which was it a LucasArts published title? I feel like... Oh, no, LucasArts published Zombies Ate My Neighbors, which was the same team. Right,
there was a relationship. Yeah, there was
some connection there, that I don't fully remember.
Well, they were in San Rafael, right?
Yeah, they were. Yeah, they were. And I knew some of those guys. I mean, that was just one that I remember being just kind of a funny, cool co-op game. But
I never played it. I have an admission.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I haven't played it all the way through, but it's a fun game. It's got a kind of weird vibe, man. It is a strange game.
That's what I've always heard. The world structure is weird, right? Isn't it? Yeah. Isn't it?
It's a pretty strange game. But I love the idea that his folks play this game.
Yeah, it's crazy.
A ton. Because you never know what's going to connect with people. And certainly like a generation older than us is less likely to play games just because of when they developed and everything. And I think it's great that there's, this couple who are probably, moving towards retirement or whatever are finding fun in Funkatron. So thanks for sharing that, Phil.
I want to meet Phil's parents.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awesome. I will read the second email, which has some questions and a lot to dig into here. It's from Alexander Farr. He says, a hearty hello and a strong thank you to both of you. Found the cast when the Kotaku article on your Final Fantasy IX series caught my attention, and now it keeps me from pulling my hair out while sitting in Los Angeles traffic. I'm going to have to start keeping a tally and send Jason Schreier some money or something. But anyway, he says, the litany of questions I have for you guys tends to grow with every episode, but I figured for my first email I'd try to focus on one big topic, E3, which of course just ended a few weeks ago. Brett, of course, had Tacoma there this year, but I was mostly curious about the experiences you've both had in the past. How many times have you gone, if any? Having both worked on AAA games with big announcements, what's the process of preparing for those, at E3 or otherwise, and how involved were you? How much can a game change based on E3 feedback? As a fan, was there anything that had ever blown you away or got you excited? I'll go back through these because they're
This is a multiple part question.
Multiple part paragraph here. Does working in the industry take away from the pageantry of those big reveals? Another question you guys can talk about for hours. Seriously, I'm just scratching the surface of things you both could ramble on about that I would find fascinating. I've had to take a large break from playing due to the two little ones running around my house, but the conversations between the two of you keep my passion alive and well stated. Please don't lose the determination, creativity, and love for play that shines through in your games and podcast. A now lifelong fan, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
And then he has a PS about maybe packaging some multiplayer games together to do a little series on, kind of like we did with Eco and Shadow and The Last Guardian. So that we could cover a few more,
that's
games
a good
at
idea.
once. That's one thing. So anyway, the first of the questions was how many times we've gone, if any. I don't know how many times you've gone. I've only gone the once.
I've gone 3, maybe 4, but I think 3 times. Once for RC, obviously for Halo 5 recently, a couple years ago, and then when I was at Lucas, I think I went.
Did you go as a fan?
Yeah, just as a fan / for quote unquote company research. Right. Kind of thing. I got that approved somehow through luck and finagling. And that one I remember pretty vividly because I saw Eco in the corner of Sony's booth in an early state. Oh, wow. And it was like not popular, right? Nobody knew what it was really. It was kind of just in the corner, and I somehow found it. I think someone actually maybe told me to go play it on the floor, and I still have that vivid memory because it just was such a gem to find.
I can actually remember you telling us about it when you came back.
Really? Oh yeah.
Like that you got a chance to play it. Yeah.
I think I made a big deal out of it then too. So that was it. But for RC and for both RC and Halo 5, they're focused on the game. So it's going to kind of more for the enjoyment and the research of it. That one time is really the better way to go as a developer. The other 2 times for Halo 5, I was behind closed doors the whole time almost. Like I almost did not,
They rolled you out to try.
I was in the Microsoft area, and it's not, it's fun for showing and talking about the game, of course, and it's great for the team and stuff. But and we had an enormous booth, kind of section on the floor, but it's a lot of work. It's hard work, and it's not really there for fun. And RC was fun because I wasn't as involved, and we just had the theater demo, and Kat was playing.
I was more involved. I don't know if you remember.
No, I don't remember.
They had us. They had a few of us sprinkled out in other booths. So I was in, I want to say AMD's booth, maybe.
Oh yeah, no, I remember. Yep, I remember that.
Yeah. I think I was in AMD's booth or some hardware company's booth, and they had various games. And I can remember, and I worked there basically all day with like a half-hour break.
Yeah, oof.
And would just stand there, and we had 2 or 3 computers, and people would come up and play, and I would explain the game, and I had my patter all worked out, and we had actually prepared. The marketing department had us come in, and a number of us on the team present the game. As if we were going to be speaking to the media or to buyers, I guess.
Oh, yeah. You got to go through all the training.
Yeah, we had to audition, basically, to see if we were able to. And I was so nervous for that. I hate public speaking. And I'm not big on crowds either, which is why I don't go to E3 usually. But so there I was on the floor, and it was super loud. But I do remember, tons of people came up and played the game, and I just I had my patter, and I would talk about stuff. And when things would happen in the game, I had little funny things to say. I got really good at that. Visor would swipe away, and I'd say, of course your visor is self-cleaning, and then just this whole thing that you would do. But the first day, there was a Marine who came back again and again. Whenever there was an open computer, he would come back and play the level again.
Wow.
All day long. He just kept coming back. And
that's cool.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. And because we ended up talking a fair amount because he kept wanting to play the game. I was like, yeah, of course. You're getting really good at it. You show off the game very well. And then I can focus on the people on the other 2 computers. And he would ask things like, is there fratricide? And I'd say, well, there's friendly fire. And he said, oh, you mean fratricide? I mean, he'd tell me no, that's not, this isn't a squad. This is a team.
Right. Yeah. Really I actually think I remember you telling me that story afterwards. Because we had that debate we literally had, I don't know if you told them at the time, but we had that debate of what we were actually going to call the foursome, and
right,
because it technically from military standard wasn't correct.
Right.
But squad is just a cooler
Sounds cooler.
the cooler name than team.
All right, so he says, having worked on both AAA games with big announcements, what's the process of preparing for those? So I kind of actually went into that a little bit with the Republic Commando at E3 or otherwise, and how involved were you? I think the most I ever was involved was with Republic Commando. I was not involved other than, making a demo stable or whatever, in some of my later games. I was really not very involved at all in other preparation. Lately, I think it's more, you're trying to get that spectacle going, and the programmers are not necessarily the best for that. So and you, of course, you go out and speak to the press about your game, so you're kind of in a different spot.
Yeah, I mean it's it was a smaller version on RC, but yeah, with Halo 5, it's really, I guess I would say it's the typical version of that from a AAA standpoint, right? I mean, it's months and months of preparation, just working on the demo alone and kind of trying to perfect that, because we were obviously on the in the press conference, and then the media training, as you mentioned, right? Like there's a lot of that goes on. There's big messaging, consistency, and like Brett said, you kind of have to audition a little bit to make sure that you can actually do it. Yeah. And then once you kind of get trained up, they start using you for all over the place, right? Not just E3, but it's extremely nerve-wracking, and I'm always nervous. And I guess I don't mind public speaking, but I kind of do, Yeah. But the way I look at it is it's important for the team, it's important for the game, and I want to, so all, kind of my summary though, V3 is, I feel like it's really exhilarating for the first few hours, but the problem is that it's not few hours long. Exactly, it's really busy. It's just overwhelming the senses, and it's cool to see stuff. I think it was cooler to go in the RC era. These days, I feel like I get a better version of E3 online than I do being there. Yeah. To be honest, that's just me.
Yeah, we'll touch on that, I think, when we get to some of the other questions. Yeah. For me as well, because I can't imagine going. Like at Bethesda, I had some colleagues who would go every year, and I totally get their excitement. Like I'm totally excited, and I watch all the presentations and all that stuff. But I just can't. I can't face crowds of that magnitude. I'm just not. I'm not a very extroverted person most of the time.
Yeah, I don't get that.
So it's really hard for me to be, tons of parties or whatever. Anyway, he says, how much can a game change based on E3 feedback? In my experience, not much.
Not much, yeah. Because I think most of the time, well, I don't know. That's been my experience, right? I don't know if that'd be the same for everybody. Because some games do announce, years and years, and we, for Halo 5 at least, we did announce. We announced early, but we didn't show any gameplay footage for a long time. So by the time we were showing gameplay footage, things were pretty much in the can and stuff. So E3 isn't typically a place where you do look for your feedback. It's actually, like we talked about with Mark, you better be doing a lot of that stuff, behind
long before.
In the studio years beforehand, right? You should be doing that stuff all along the way to some degree. So the feedback you're getting is really coming from other places, other sources than something like E3. The thing that is hopefully, not always the case, but hopefully the most valuable for E3 for the team is really just, as Mark talked about with the day one demo, the OEM demo, is really just getting it out there. I remember hearing some of the stories. I wasn't on Halo 4, but hearing some of the stories because 343 hadn't really done anything yet, right? So the team really didn't know what they had, and when that first press conference demo for Halo 4 came out and was well received, the team, the morale goes up and people get excited. They just were crunching to get it out there, and so there's this rejuvenation that usually happens for a team that shows something at E3, but it doesn't change too much.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard tell. I haven't had the experience of working at a place where
there's stories.
But I've definitely heard stories where people have said, that their producer or publisher, somebody on the publisher side went to E3 and saw that the big trend was X, whatever X was. It's all about
you mean in
being
that
in
way,
a third-person camera, or it's all about this gimmick or that gimmick. It's all bullet time this year, and come back and said to the team, how do we need to fit in some gadget X, whatever special ingredient that I saw a ton of, not really thinking ahead to the fact, well, we're not up for another year. That's going to be old hat, by that time.
Yeah. I wasn't taking that question. Okay. So yeah, that's a good point. I took the question differently.
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly for games that we've taken E3,
they haven't changed much.
They haven't changed.
But to your point about E3's influence.
From E3.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That's something that probably people don't, maybe could guess, but don't really hear about or think about too much. Every single E3, and I'd say GDC maybe as well.
GDC too, yeah.
Game developers people come back from those things with some, and it's not just producers, but it's all sorts, right?
Yeah, that's true. Often artists are like, hey, oh my god, the global illumination that's in.
Yeah, people get excited about stuff, right? Yeah. They want to.
How can we get some of that, special sauce in our game? And it's like, oh my god, So we're shipping in 6 months. I don't.
Yeah. So it depends on where you're at in the dev cycle. But it can be inspirational, but it also can be tricky to stay focused. As Mark said, like you come back from those things and there is this kind of new whiz bang thing going on, and it'll be something else in 6 months as well, right? So you kind of got to stick to your guns on certain things.
This next question was, as a fan, was there anything that had ever blown you away or got you excited? I know mine. You got one?
You go first as a fan.
Okay. The biggest thing I was ever excited about that I saw on E3 in one of the streamed press events was the Nintendo Wii. I was legitimately blown away by the opportunities I thought that were going to be there. Not really thinking about how Nintendo's never been great for third parties, but just like the world that opened up and the market I felt like that was going to open up, and I think I was proven right. If you go back, I actually did an interview that year with Evil Avatar's interviewer, who's now, I think I'm trying to remember now where he is. I'm going to look it up so I don't misspeak, but his name's Phil Kolar.
He's at Polygon, I think.
I think you're right. Yes.
Yeah. Phil was one of the original Rebel FM founders.
Yes, well, he was also
at One Up.
He did Evil Avatar radio back in the day.
Ah, okay. Phil's great.
Phil's terrific. His name was Kef Karen or something like that at the time. He had some handle. But he interviewed me for that, and he kind of asked me about the big three, that Sony and Microsoft, and I was kind of like, Sony, giant crab, Microsoft, whatever. I don't remember what Microsoft even had that year. But I was like, but this Wii thing, this is totally different. It's a game changer, I felt like. And it really blew me away. And to date, it's the only console I ever bought for my parents, so it was a thing that I thought, really had a chance to break through with a different audience. And I think it did, but unfortunately only basically for Wii Sports. So.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Yeah, I guess I am, as we've talked about on the podcast, I am a fanboy in the truest definition, as opposed to Brett in the same way. You're a fan of a few things, but not really in the same way. So maybe the obvious one that you could probably guess is I remember Metal Gear 4. Like Metal Gear, I was always a sucker for that once I got into that series.
Those have been good reveals at E3 every
and
time they've done one. Yeah.
That's their bread and butter, right? They were just always good at that, right?
Yeah.
And
I can remember every one of those.
Yeah, exactly. So it was an event, and then the other more recent one that comes to mind that's a little bit just top of mind because I've actually gone back to it and trying to finish it finally is Witcher 3. I was a big fan of the series all along the way, kind of in the background, but it wasn't, 1 and 2 were pretty big. They weren't huge, but I remember just seeing that early Witcher 3 stuff and just being like, oh man, that is what I wanted this series to be all along, and it totally delivered. But I remember being really excited about that demo.
All right, last one. Does working in the industry take away from the pageantry of those big reveals?
Yes.
Yeah, we know how the sausage is made. We look, I'm not to pick on anyone, but I look at like Anthem this year and I'm like, wow, that looks really cool. That is not going to be anything like that when it comes out. That is a really great targeted thing for a game that they don't even know what it is yet, because it's 2 years away, So I think, and I don't want to, downplay anybody's excitement about these games, because you should be excited. They have a vision they're going to try to achieve, but what they're showing you is often a proof of concept of like, this is what we think it could be. And they're going to run into certain game development realities, and we don't even know what they are, but they're just going to be there. And it's not going to turn out exactly what you had in mind. I mean, I think that's where a lot of kind of gamer rage comes from, is like people build up in their heads what this thing's going to be from this early trailer or whatever, and these little dribs and drabs of information you get. And
I mean, No Man's Sky says
No Man's Sky. Oh my God, what a perfect example, right? There's a game that...
You see what I did there? Says hello.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Yeah, well done.
It's Hello Games, right?
It's Hello Games. Oh, now you ruined it.
No, I just... okay.
Right out,
I did. That's what I do. I ruin things. That's what I do.
You were right out there being Joe Danger, and then suddenly...
Oh, nice.
You jump in and explain everything.
Done.
Anyway, that's an even more perfect example, because we actually have seen both ends of that. We've seen the like crazy hype, and people like projecting all the things they wished for in a game. Whether that was like a modern day Elite, with an infinite whatever, or people who had high hopes for Spore or whatever, and they bundle all that stuff into that. And I looked at that and said, okay, well, some of these things that they're describing are not going to happen the way that, they'll happen in some way. I can see how they could happen, but not in a fully connected MMO sort of way, not with like 10 people, I think were on that team, 12 maybe, and I just, you just know, like, it's not going to happen in the way people expect.
Well, and then
you hope they'll capture some of what people love.
Yeah, I think the unfortunate thing that I totally agree with your gamer rage. Like No Man's Sky represents, and this isn't their fault. Like I hate bringing that example up because I feel for those guys, and it's just sort of like the series of events that got them to launch is really more of the problem than it was actually what the result was. You know what I mean? Because it was built up, and that initial trailer that was selling a different experience, and like that's the stuff you have to be careful of. And your point about Anthem and stuff, sort of like, well, and I definitely don't want to speak too much about Anthem myself in my position, but the only thing I'll say there is like the player script in Anthem was sort of a bit of an orange flag for me, because it was sort of almost too casual and scripted, in its way. So you kind of got a feeling that there was a lot of stuff. But I would like to be optimistic that I think I'm more of an optimist than I should be for things like this, because I do see stuff like that and the fanboy geek nerd in me wants it to be like that, So I really hope. But the developer in me kind of just...
Right, sure. Yeah. I guess what I see is, like, as a programmer and with a fair amount of experience, like, I have a pretty good sense of what they'll actually be able to do on their target hardware in the targeted amount of time. Like, I have a pretty good sense of, like, okay, that's possible or not possible. But I do still get very excited by a couple of different things. I will always be excited about like a new Uncharted game, or because there are certain types of games that I just love to play, and that I've played every entry in a series. Like I've played almost every Assassin's Creed now, and I'll just keep playing them because I just like playing them, and I'm totally fine with that. Like and they go on about it's different in this way. I'm like, I don't care. It's Assassin's Creed. I'm good. It's fine. So I do get excited about those things. And then I do actually, when I look at something like Anthem or No Man's Sky for that matter, I look at it and I say, well, here's something that's at least different.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's not, gritty Space Marine. It's, there's some, I probably won't play something like Anthem just because it's multiplayer, and I don't play a lot of those, because I just, I don't know anybody here in Maryland to play with, for example, or whatever, and I don't have a big online cadre. So those aren't things I tend to play. Like, I played Destiny for a week. I was like, that was cool, and I was done. But I do look at those things and say, well, these are interesting because at least they're pushing in different directions. I mean, like he was talking about, like Mark was talking about, Half-Life came out of a different sort of environment. Like, this is a different sort of thing. It's, new IPs are always kind of interesting just from that standpoint, especially if they're kind of in an area that I might generally find interesting. Like, if they would show a Western, on screen at E3 every year, I'd be like, cool. There's the Western I'm going to play this year.
Yeah.
But those are few and far between, I'm afraid. So, and there was no Red Dead this year. So. But,
it's a fun and interesting, weird topic, the E3 for developers. I think it's weird, and this year caused a lot of debate, obviously, because of the 15,000 public members that were there, and
and
how that changed.
Extra hell for me.
Yeah. Apparently, it was super crowded,
wall to wall.
Yeah, but just kind of, I only bring that up in sort of like the identity of E3, right? And what kind of show is it? Because it's always, as Alex probably well knows, it's a business show primarily, right? That's its goal, but that it seems to be morphing and probably needs to morph. To survive and compete with the PAXs of the world.
That was the thing that immediately came to mind. I've never been to one of those either. Again, just because of the crowds. My thing has always been GDC, and I've missed the last, at least last year and maybe the year before. I just, wasn't really in a place where I could justify going. But, for me, that's more like I go and lots of developers are there and they're my buddies and I know all the places to eat, and, I'm very comfortable in that space and I have friends who live nearby and so it becomes a whole personal / business trip. E3, I don't really have a lot of that. I don't know lots of people in the LA area and the show isn't something that really appeals to me personally.
It's hard to get a lot out of it, because you don't, unless you're invited, you have to stand in lines to see stuff,
sure.
And you don't really, So, I mean, it's definitely, I'm sure, exhilarating for the younger crowd. I think it's just we're old and grumpy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're old and grumpy.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably that your moo-moo is starting to ride up. In any case. All right, well, I guess that is about all we're going to do for the evening. That was a great conversation we had, and thank you for your emails. Again, you can send more of those, and we will read them and answer your questions, however personal they are, about Tim's personal habits, at devgameclub@gmail.com. You can find me at Brett_Duville on Twitter, and him at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
And, of course, you can find the podcast at DevGameClub on Twitter. You can find us on the web at devgameclub.com and, of course, in your podcatcher of choice. Please rate and review. We read those on the show as well when we get them. We have a few backed up, but we're getting to them. And I promise next week we will do the drawing that I keep putting off because I keep forgetting until we get to the show. Because, again, I'm shipping a game right now. And I guess the last thing to mention, once again, is that our outro music is a remix of our theme song by Ficus, a.k.a. at giant_rat on Twitter. Thanks so much. Yeah, I know. You love that.
It's cool.
It is cool. So for Dev Game Club this week, I'm Brett Duville, and he's
Tim Longo.
Good night.
Good night.
You want to give that good night another try? Good night.
No,
is your voice changing?
That'll be a special one. That
people are going to cut that in. They'll be like, "Oh, this is going to be the good night now."